the early first century, most people don't connect it that in that time, all of their culture, all of their religious festivals and rituals had came with them. And so even though they were being Hellenized, we know in Acts chapter 14 that Paul and Barnabas were thought to be Zeus and Hermes, which that's the Hellenization of the Galatians or the Celtics. And so they began to believe in those gods. They believed in a pantheon of gods, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the Apostle Paul begins to address them because at this particular time, he wants the Galatians, the Celtics, right, to be free from the worship of gods, of their gods, and from the celebration or the observances of these festivals. He uses the term in verse 10 of Galatians chapter 4. He says, you observe days and months and seasons and years. Now, this may not seem like anything, but here's the argument of Galatians. The argument in Galatians is Paul is convincing the Gentile Christians, which are the Celtics. They are not Jewish. They are of Celtic heritage. The word Galatian is derived from Celtic. This group of people is being pressured by the Jews to take on the Jewish law, which comes with it circumcision and their festivals, new moons and Sabbaths. So Paul is arguing with them that I don't want you to observe these things because it just takes you back into the bondage that you came out of. And so let's read from verse 8 to verse 11. But indeed, you did not know God. You served those gods which by nature are not gods. Who is he talking about? He's talking about this huge list of gods that they had. They had a list of gods: Dagda, the Morangan, Lung, Danu, Sarananos, Bridge, and much, much more. They had gods and goddesses, and they were serving these gods. And so the Apostle Paul says, indeed, when you did not know God, you served those gods which by nature are not gods. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desired again to be in bondage? So he says, why are we going back to bondage in serving these cultural, weak, elemental things that you have been set free from in Christ? Verse 10, you observe days, months, seasons, and years. And I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. What is the Apostle Paul saying here? He's saying that I fought for you to be free from these things, free from the gods that you were serving, and free from the observance of these particular days, months, seasons, and years. Now, if you understand anything about the Celtic religions, they have an entire calendar full of sacred days that they celebrate. And they had days, they had months, they had seasons. A lot of their celebrations coincide with seasons, just like Samhain, which later on becomes Halloween. Samhain was a celebration of the harvest season, the end of the harvest season, and the beginning of the winter season. And so this was a transition period in between. And for those who heard my podcast on Christian witches, they have times and years where they pray for certain things, prosperity, good luck, fertility. They get their information so that they can accomplish the things that they want in life. And so this coincides with this worship or serving of gods that by nature, he says, are not gods. And so what are these gods, right? They're the elemental spirits, right? The beggarly elements, the spirits of this world are being served. And I know for some of you like, wow, this is crazy that this is in these verses. Well, it is interesting because unless you do an examination of history, you don't realize that the Celtics actually ended up in Galatia, and Galatians is actually the Celtics. And moving forward, the Apostle Paul then ministers to them and preaches the gospel to them, but then they are under attack by the Jews who want them to become Jewish in order to become saved. And Paul says, look, if you do that, you're actually going backwards instead of forwards. And so Samhain, this particular day, is just one of many. It is the beginning of their new year. And so he says the observance of days. So Samhain was a day. It was in the month of October. The season was fall. And it says years. This is the new year. This is the new year. So all of those things, Samhain falls into all of these categories. And you say, why you keep saying Samhain? Because that's what it was originally called. It wasn't called Halloween. It wasn't called Halloween. It was called Samhain. It became Halloween when the Catholic Church, somewhere around the 6th or 7th century AD, felt that it was evil, and the Christians in that area of Europe, this is now in Europe, the Roman Catholics began to hijack it, and they turned it into All Hallows Eve. And it is because November 1st became All Saints Day, which is a celebration of the martyrs who were faithful and died for their faith. And so October 31st became the eve of that day. And so in making November 1st All Saints Day, inadvertently they made this October 31st the eve of All Saints Day. And so that's where we got Hallows Eve, which then became Halloween. Crazy, right? And then throughout history, because later on we found it back in its European roots, Halloween was transplanted to America when the Irish came over in the 1800s, and they brought over traditions like bobbing for apples and trick or treat, which they would the kids would knock on doors or vandalize houses, and they would put masks on to disguise themselves. In the early 19th century, in the early 1900s, it became violent, and it actually became a point of extortion, according to historian David Scahl. He's a historian and author. He said it became extortion, that if you wanted them to leave your store alone or your house alone, then you would give kids candy, and then it became kind of a tradition to hand out candy to the kids on this particular day, and that's where trick or treat became the calling card, and then all of a sudden it's well known in America. But there's so many other parts to this, right? Because when you go back to the time of the Bible, in the time of the Bible where they were worshiping their gods, they had their priests who were called the Druids, and the Druids were magicians and sorcerers. They were their holy men, so to speak, and they taught them and connected them to the gods. And so this book of Galatians is very deep, and this Halloween that people celebrate today or observe today is interesting. And so Paul, let's look at verse 10 again in Galatians chapter 4. You observe days, months, seasons, and years. This term observe, 3906 in your Strongs, it means to follow alongside insidiously, scrupulously, and superstitiously. It means to keep the rituals and traditions of a day. Insidiously, the reason why he uses this term, because insidious is something that is subtle, that is progressive, but eventually becomes harmful. And so when they're celebrating these days, at first it's not a big deal, but after a while they're caught up in it. Wow, that sounds like American culture today, where Halloween is very insidious, because it seems like it's not a big deal. Next thing you know, you're caught up in it, and it's harmful. It can be